Oh hell Internet! Once again, here I am putting forward my unsolicited, informal perspective on one philosophical work. This time by Hannah Arendt, who I would definitely describe myself as influenced by. This is the fifth essay from the 1961 collection Between Past and Future. I would really like to tackle the heart of that book, the third and fourth essays, but that is a much bigger project for another time. Characteristically for Arendt, the crisis in education follows on from the loss of tradition, which is inevitable, but is not going to give humanity a comfortable entry into the modern world. I wanted to talk about this essay because it is my very firm opinion that everyone should be a lifelong learner in this extremely complex modern mass society we find ourselves in. And this essay puts a lot of detail into why that should be the case. Plato once said that man will not be happy until kings become philosophers, and as a famed opponent of democracy, he meant it. But it's debatable whether this was ever true. However, in the modern mass society, democracy or not, it certainly is not true. I wanted to replace it with something affirmative like, now we need all people to become philosophers in some way, but that just rang hollow. Nonetheless, education, or possibly learning, is a key piece of this puzzle. Arendt's prose is dense and hard to read, but also poetic and powerful. I hope I have parsed it correctly here, and there are a few places I'm not sure. I admit I have added the occasional comma or omitted an occasional word to aid quotability. I welcome any comments that people may have. I also hope I managed to put my perspective across in a way that is clear to listeners, but I claim no authority. I'm going to start with an executive summary to lay everything out, and I'll also post this separately as a shorter video for those who don't want to watch the full essay. If you are watching that executive summary, then the full version is here. The crisis in education is in 4 parts, which are not titled, but which I will call Part 1, the cultural background, Part 2, 3 faulty assumptions, Part 3, the nature of education, and finally Part 4, education and modernity. In Part 1, Arendt reviews her arguments from earlier in the book about the loss of tradition in the modern world and how this is creating a number of different crises as we enter into the mass society. And side note, Arendt's use of the term mass society is absolutely the basis for the term modern mass society, which I've used in recent videos. The crisis of education is in American schools, which is Arendt's primary focus in the United States, and this is the slipping of standards that we see to this day, but not just in that country. The crisis of education could be seen as fairly minor in among the other crises of the modern world, but it's actually fundamental because of its relationship to natality. Natality is Arendt's concept which broadly means the bringing of new forms into existence, and it is intimately connected with the human condition. Children are both the product and a source of natality, and also the future of the world we live in. The rest of the essay expands on the impact of this. In Part 2, Arendt says that the crisis in education has come mainly out of 3 faulty assumptions in the way that education has developed across the modern world. These are: 1. There is a child's world which should be, as far as possible, self-governing and allow children to have autonomy. 2. That teaching is a skill which is separate from the content to be taught and in many ways is more important than the content. And 3, that it's only really possible to know what you have actually done yourself. Unlike some, Arendt is not hyperbolic about progressive education. She acknowledges that all of these assumptions have some sensible intentions behind them, but the way they are applied in modern education is ultimately destructive to the natality of children, and by extension then, the future of the world. This damage happens in 2 major ways. In the first case, children are exposed to the public space of the social world before they are fully ready to be so. And in the second case, children are left without authority to guide them in the process of learning about the world they've been born into. The first of these problems is fairly clearly a real problem in the actual world, most widely seen perhaps in the changing social media space today and the way it affects young people. The second problem may seem to be less of a problem, perhaps even desirable, but Arendt will explain why she disagrees with this because of the nature and purpose of education itself. This is the topic of part 3. Hi, this is Editing Adam, and I just realised I really didn't say anything about whether or not these assumptions really are faulty. Now, that's not exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to lay out Arendt's position, but I should say something, of course, that you could disagree with Arendt completely and say these assumptions are fine, or that we're not making these assumptions. I think you can see some evidence for some of these assumptions, certainly just on the face of education looking around the world, but if they are true, then they will be true to different extents depending on who you are or where you are. So there's obviously quite a lot of nuance to be had in that conversation as well, but that's not really what I'm trying to get at in this essay. Arendt begins part 3 by noticing the dual nature of the child. They are a human being in the process of becoming, which is a simple life process, but they are also a new person emerging into the human world, and that is a social function. There is some conflict between these two factors, and it explains why children need to be protected from the public space, and why even adults still require a private bubble to find respite from the public space. Returning to education, Arendt considers the dilemma of trying to pass on a sense of the world to the newcomers without disrupting their essential natality in the process. She concludes that basically, we are always educating for a world that is becoming out of joint, starting to conflict with itself. To preserve the world against the mortality of its creators, it must be constantly set right. The problem is to educate in such a way that this setting right remains actually possible. Exactly for the sake of what is new and revolutionary in every child, education must be conservative. It must preserve this newness and introduce it as a new thing into an old world. If you listen to my whole essay, then you'll see that I prefer the word preservative to conservative in that context. And Arendt makes fairly clear that she does not equate this at all with political conservatism. However, she insists that the authority of the educator is not the same as their qualifications to teach. Qualification is not sufficient for authority. Authority comes from accepting responsibility for the world as it exists and being prepared to introduce the newcomers with integrity and concern. This role is fulfilled by every adult who takes that responsibility, as much as we might wish to foist it off onto educators. And, in Arendt's forceful opinion, anyone who refuses to assume joint responsibility for the world should not have children and must not be allowed to take part in educating them. Finally, part 4 tries to assess the form education can actually take in the modern mass society, and concludes that education must be decisively separated from the rest of the public sphere, and it also should have a defined endpoint where one's education is considered finished. This does raise a few uncomfortable questions, such as in what way is education different from indoctrination, and I will not go on to answer that. It could easily be the subject of its own 5,000-word essay. The Crisis in Education gives a very detailed account of the essential problem of modern education, whether you go on to agree with Arendt or not, and it draws interesting distinctions between education and learning. Exploring these relationships would be the next step in answering the uncomfortable questions that might be raised, and that is of interest to me because ultimately I want to say that there is a place for the modern state in enabling adults to pursue learning, but we must be careful to distinguish between that and educating adults, especially when that becomes re-education. In this essay, Arendt lays out some of the problems we might face in tackling these issues.